Good day, everybody. Welcome to today's event, Finding Traps in an RFP. Today is Thursday, July 16th, 2020. I'm V Marino, Director of GovConectx and GovConectx Foundation. During the presentation, please mute your microphones. If you have questions, use the chat function at any time. You can request the PowerPoints from this presentation by sending an email to GovConectx@gmail.com. That's GovConectx@gmail.com. I'd like to mention our sponsor, BPX Technologies. BPX Technologies, a GMS registrar company, provides the personnel and critical support necessary to prepare clients for certification for multiple business and security standards, along with a host of other related service. Assists clients manage difficult systems and security projects, applying its proprietary QSRP protocols framework, and delivers best-in-class proposal support to organizations and managed contracts. And FEC LLC. When the banks say no, they say yes. Today's presenter is Lewis Rhodes. Lewis is an experienced government contracts attorney with both law firm and in-house experience. In addition to his legal career, Lewis is a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves and has a combined 26 years of service on active duty as a reservist. As a veteran, Lewis takes special pride in representing veteran-owned businesses and has developed expertise in regulations governing VOSB and SDVOSB certified companies. Lewis, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Vaughn. And along the reserve lines, I'm actually coming to you live from a BOQ room on Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I'm down here for my two-week summer training. So that's why the decor is a little hotelish in the back. So, but anyway, I want to reiterate what Vaughn said. There's a lot of information I'm going to cover here. 2 hours is not a lot of time to go into depth. So as I go through topics, if there's a question or I'm too fast on something, please type in a chat. I have the chat box open. So instead of just droning on for an hour and a half, it's good to get questions and make sure I'm addressing everything you guys need to hear. Like I said, and even if you just need me to slow down or repeat something, feel free to go ahead and chime in and ask. So again, hidden traps in an RFP and pre-award protests. The second part, the pre-award protest, is the important part of the whole process as we're going to talk here. This is a subject very near and dear to my heart. I've been a government contracts attorney, probably been my specialty for about 12 years. And I've seen multiple clients come to me over the years and want to protest something. And I had to tell them that they couldn't because they needed to protest it before they submitted their bid because it was an issue in the RFP. So the material we're going to cover today is going to talk about things that you see in an RFP that if you don't protest them before you submit your bid, you're not going to be able to protest them at the end. You know, everybody knows about bid protests after an award. I don't think everyone is quite as informed on pre-award protests, and that's why this topic is pretty important. I've seen more clients lose protest opportunities and contract opportunities because they didn't know they had to protest in the front of the process. Next slide, please. Okay, so pre-award protests. I know we're focused on the RFP, but I want to lay the foundation here. A pre-award protest is one that challenges something in the solicitation itself. A post-award protest, obviously, you're saying, hey, I wasn't treated fairly. You gave the awardee something. You did something wrong in the process. The pre-award says, hey, your solicitation is messed up and you need to fix it. Okay, and the GAO protest regulations are pretty clear, on when you need to file it, right? If you're challenging the solicitation itself, it shall be filed prior to bid opening or to time set for receipt of initial proposals. So if your proposal's due next week, you need to protest before the proposal goes in. Now here's the rub where I've also seen a couple of clients get themselves in trouble. If you file a pre-award protest and then do not submit your proposal to the solicitation you're challenging, the agency can come in and try to dismiss you as not being an interested party because you didn't submit a bid. So even if you pre-award protest and file the pre-award protest timely, you also have to submit your solicitation on the due date. If you submit a protest early enough, you may get a stay of everything and not have to submit the bid, but you still have to push forward with the solicitation and be prepared to submit it, even if you are going to go ahead and file a pre-award protest. So that's the other side of this coin that we need to keep in mind. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so, as an attorney and a protest attorney, I love to protest, right? It's a fun process. I like to catch the government's hands in their cookie jar. Post-award, it's pretty clear that government messed up, you did something wrong, we're going to protest. Okay, the pre-award protest is, that's kind of your last resort. You don't want to jump into filing a protest right off the bat. All right, during the process, there's several opportunities from the beginning to the end where you should get involved, where hopefully you can get something resolved short of needing to file a protest. Right, protests aren't free, and sometimes it can miff the government a little bit if you pre-award protest, and especially if you hadn't talked to them first. All right, a lot of times when we see big programs or bigger, more serious, sizable solicitations, you're going to see a draft RFP. All right, make sure you go through the RFP pretty closely in the draft time, not just looking to see, if it's something you can do the work and bid it, but look to see that everything in the RFP makes sense. Your first cut in this process is during the draft, submit your comments. I will tell you, and I'm sure those of you who've been in the industry for a while will understand, the government really takes to heart the draft and they look for industry comments. So take the opportunity, pour through it a little bit, get the questions and the comments in, and tell the government where you think they need to fix the solicitation. All right, that's the first hurdle in this process. Okay, the next one is during the Q&A. All right, if you have during the Q&A time when you're asking your questions, it's another time for you to raise the issues, of the solicitation and where things have problems, difficulties, issues. All right, we've all done proposals, we've all done Q&As, and a lot of times the government is scrambling to answer a Q&A, and they're putting out 100 answers, scrambling to meet deadlines so they don't have to delay proposal due dates or extend everything. So Q&A is good. It's a good opportunity to do that, but sometimes a more serious issue can get lost in the shuffle a little bit during the Q&A process. One thing that I found was pretty helpful was an email from, especially when I was an in-house general counsel, an email from me to the contracting officer with my signature block that said lawyer, usually was a little more successful than necessarily asking a question in a Q&A. A lot of times we'd ask a Q&A question, it would come back, the government wouldn't really answer it or address it. I would send an email, with the scary lawyer signature block to the contracting officer. I would point out the problem with the solicitation, and I would bring up the concept of a pre-award protest. That often would get their attention, and it's an easy way to come in. You can come in low threatening and just kind of, hey, matter of factly say, hey, here's the issue. You've got an evaluation criteria that doesn't make any sense. I've tried to ask questions about it. You're not responsive. You're going to leave us no choice but to file a pre-award protest in order to get this clarified. I'd rather resolve it at this point in time than having to get to that issue, right? An email like that is often very, very successful to flag issues in the proposal. And it helps when you point to specific GAO precedent or case law or other FAR provisions that show where the solicitation has a flaw or an error in it. So again, long before you actually file the protest at GAO, you've got ample opportunities to go through to try to get this fixed with the government. Okay, we've been around the block a few times. The reason pre-award protests exist is the government either doesn't listen, doesn't agree with you, or just, you know, believes you're wrong, and you have no choice but to go to GAO and file the pre-award protest. Now, the protest, a pre-award protest doesn't necessarily stay everything during the evaluation, like a post-award protest that gets to seek a stay. But generally, the government is not going to risk pushing forward with an evaluation while a protest is going on. So, I mean, a lot of times that, you know, because if GAO rules in your favor, you're going to, you know, they're going to have to go back to the starting board. So practically, they don't have to stop what they're doing. Generally, the government's going to stop what they're doing going through the pre-award protest. And I've had issues, you know, more times than I should, where, you know, we've gone through the whole process, had the Q&A, sent an email to the contracting officer, the government refused to make any changes. We file a pre-award protest, you know, 5 days later, there's corrective action and they make the change to the solicitation. It's kind of frustrating to go through that and shouldn't get to that point, but it happens frequently. So, you know, again, you know, there's a buildup, and you want to take the path, and you want to give the government opportunities to remedy what you see as the error before you rush to the pre-award protest. You know, I get questions, just, you know, not exactly on topic, but I get questioned all the time as a protest attorney. Hey, you know, does the government's going to get mad at me if I protest? They're going to get, you know, they're going to hold it against me. And I'll tell you that it's been my experience that's not usually the case. Where it is the case is if you bring a kind of frivolous or meritless protest, or in a pre-award context, if you don't give them an opportunity to fix something before you jump to the protest stage. So you definitely want to go through the process and give the government an opportunity, not even, you know, for no other purpose than to show the government that you're trying to be reasonable and work with them in the process. You know, it's important to play the game by the rules. Next slide, please. All right, so the RFP. And, you know, we're going to get into, go through the sections here. This is focusing on, this list is the FAR Part 15 RFP, right? The government puts out a source of salt, they put out a solicitation, they invite bidders, and bidders are going to be evaluated under that. A Part 8 RFP is going to have a little bit different terms, some different information in it, especially, you know, if they're buying off of a schedule. So these are the parts of, you know, we're going to go the more robust, focusing on the FAR Part 15 RFPs. So there's several sections. I'm sure everybody on here has read multiple RFPs. I'm not going to go through them all with you. The sections you'll see that are bolded or italicized are the ones I'm going to talk to in a little bit more depth. And those are the ones that you really need to pay the most attention to, with an eye on it from a, does this make sense on a protest standpoint? Okay, so we all know the sections. I'm not going to read them all to you. But so section C is a big one, the statements of work, specifications, and description. I'll get into these a little bit more in detail as I unpack each one. But that's the first one you have to read carefully. Everybody reads it carefully, right? Because you need to respond to it on the technical side. But as you're going through it on the technical side, think if something doesn't make sense, it becomes beyond answering the RFP, and it becomes hey, we got to talk to the government about clarifying this. And that's where the Q&A, and a lot of times companies do not reach out to their attorney, be it an outside counsel or an inside counsel, timely in this process. You know, I think if you have an in-house general counsel, when I worked in-house, I would work hand in hand with the proposal department, and I would help write the Q&As. If you don't have an in-house counsel, you get some of these issues that aren't just, hey, can you clarify what type of cabling I need? You know, if it gets into a little bit more substantive, it's a good thing to run past your attorney. Just because there's some magic words that you can use and magic phrases that are helpful to put in your questions when you're talking about, you know, even when it gets to the technical specifications, and we'll cover that a little bit more here in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's the rest of the sections to we got up through section M on the RFP. Okay, so sections L and M and section C I will discuss in more detail as we move forward. The other one I wanted to flag out here is another place in an RFP that you really have to look closely in is the contract administration data. Okay, what happens sometimes, and this is purely by oversight, the government may leave out certain required FAR provisions or certain required laws in an RFP. And, that's technically a protestable issue, right? If they leave out a section covering the EEO requirements, right? Hey, government, you don't have an EEO section in here. You don't have the FAR that talks about that talks about ethics and compliance. Or, if there's certain certifications that are required and that FAR provision is missing, that all goes through section G. So, a lot of it, some of this gets into, minutia every time. We all know EEO applies. We all know ethics apply. We all know the list of rules and regulations that apply to doing business with the government. So those aren't necessarily the key things if they're missing. The issue is going to be whether or not there's a special FAR provision that applies to that type of solicitation that's left out of the RFP. Especially if that FAR provision in some way is going to impact how you can bid, what you can bid. Buy America Act, perfect example, right? You have to all buy American goods. Where can they come from? If something like that is missing, that's obviously, generally that's an oversight. But that also is if it's not an oversight and the government refuses to put something in, that's another place to pay attention. I'm not going to go into much more detail on that one other than that, but that's a section to look at. Section H is also supposed to be italicized for the same reason. Special contract requirements are another one. If there's some special FAR provisions or special forms or special regs that apply that don't apply for some reason, like if it's an OCONUS bid, if it requires security clearances, things that are supposed to be in there that are not in there, that's another issue that should be looked at and raised early. That's all your admin issues. Rep certs, section K is pretty standard. I don't think I've ever seen an issue with a pre-award protest under section K. All right, section L, right, instructions on how to do your bid. That's one you need to look at. You need to pay attention for a lot of levels. I'm sure every one of us here could tell at least one story, if not multiple, on people who didn't pay attention to the instructions and didn't get their bid in on time or get it in correctly, which has been a very bad day for a lot of people. So the last one is section M, evaluation factors for award. All right, that obviously, if it's a sole source, isn't going to be in there. That is your most important area to read very, very closely, probably even more than section C on a proposal. And when I was a sunk cost at a company as an in-house counsel, they would have me read every single section M that we bid, just to make sure you're looking at it from a legal perspective, to make sure the evaluation standards and processes make sense. Excuse me. Make sense, are fair, even-handed, and don't give an advantage to any one offerer. And that's a whole lot of what we look for in a pre-award protest context, right? And I think we all know that, especially if we're not the incumbent. We don't want to see, you don't want to see an RFP or a proposal that's really written towards somebody. I think we've all seen that. I think we've all probably challenged that with different degrees of success at different times. But the whole key with this whole thing is to make sure that everything is even-handed. All right, we don't want to throw out something where it's clearly steered to a certain or specific bidder. Next slide, please. I should have brought throat lozenges to have on me. Okay, so now we're gonna unpack the specific sections, and I know I'm not that good, so please ask questions if you guys have any. Otherwise, it'll break up the monotony of me talking at a computer screen for a while. So, but we're starting with section C, as we talked about, specifications and statement of work. All right, this is next to section M. This is probably the most important area to look at in your RFP. Okay. Right off the front, when we're looking at something, we want to look at improper bundling. Now, improper bundling is an issue where the government is buying multiple items or multiple things that don't necessarily go together. All right, if I'm buying servers and wireless routers, and I'm paying for the labor to install it, okay, that makes sense. If I'm paying for IT service laborers on the same contract where I'm buying a car, right, that doesn't make sense. So you've got to look to see things that aren't necessarily related, and you can challenge the government for trying to improperly bundle them. A good example would be, if you're in a logistics or shipping type of contract. All right, if you have a logistics analyst service as part of it, you're going to provide professional services, and they're going to be logistics people. That doesn't necessarily need to be bundled with a contract for the actual shipping of product. All right, they're both logistics, and it both might be the same customer, but one that involves shipping doesn't necessarily need to have the services to go along with it. If you saw that in a proposal, and maybe you only did the shipping part and you don't have the services, or maybe you're only the services and not the shipping, that's a time to challenge that under pre-award context. You can look at it and say, again, you go through the steps and raise it to the government. And if the government can't give you a real sensible answer for why they're buying, X, Y, and Z together, improper bundling is in a pre-award context is a very good argument to bring. GAO gives the government leeway, but it's got to be related. If I'm going to buy a car and gas, or I'm going to buy IT services and IT products, that goes together. But if you're buying unrelated products or unrelated services, security guard, I want security, so I'm going to buy security guards and I'm going to buy cybersecurity. Okay, those shouldn't be put together in the same RFP. So if you see something like that, that's called improper bundling, and you want to take a close look at that and potentially challenge it. And a lot of times on that, it's the government being. I don't want to be sardonic and call the government lazy, because the government's got some contracting officers have a lot going on, but sometimes if I can do this in one RFP instead of two, that's a lot easier for my life. So that's how a lot of bundlings happen. Other things you really want to look for: certifications and licenses. Okay, I've been round and round with the government multiple times on this issue. And where this comes up is, maybe it's a CMMI certification that we need. And I'm in the process of getting my CMMI certification today. I'm going to be done with it in about 6 weeks, but my proposal is due in 2 weeks. And the government writes the solicitation that says you shall have a CMMI level 3 before you submit your bid. Okay. So, and I got a question, Prashant. I will answer you in a second as soon as I finish this piece on certifications. The government is not supposed to require certifications that you don't need until execution at the time of the bid. And it's very challengeable if you're in the position where you are actively working on the certification and it's pretty well established you're going to have it before the bid. You should be able to submit your bid. Now, obviously, if you're going through CMMI and you fail and you somehow don't get it, then you would be ineligible for award at that time. You should tell the government if you're not going to have it before the award time, but you need to. The government should give you the opportunity. Same thing with certain licenses, right? And when I talk about pre-award context and waiving your rights, I have a very good friend of mine. We were classmates at the Naval Academy. I've known him for over 30 years. About 2.5 months ago, he wanted to protest something, and I had to tell him he couldn't. He does pharmacology and medical device reselling to the government. the government wanted a certain license, and it was in the RFP, and he didn't challenge it. And when he lost the bid based on that license, he wanted to challenge it at that time. And I had to tell him that we couldn't, and explain to him that, hey, here's where we made the mistake and when we should have. So, I hate telling any client that, but somebody I've known as long as my friend Chris, it was really, really difficult to say that and deliver that kind of information to a client. So I got a question from Prashant. Said, do you have an improper bundling example for IT services only? I understand IT service and product bundling. Okay, all right. Obviously, if it's related, IT services, I think it would be related as well. If somebody's trying to buy help desk, and in addition to help desk, they also want to buy, very high-end cybersecurity, the kind of guys that cost a lot of money versus someone who's just a simple help desk, I would argue that that's an improper bundling. And my argument would be like, listen, there may be 6 companies that can do the high-end cybersecurity work, but there's 600 companies that can do the IT help, the simple help desk, and most of them would be small businesses. And by putting together a high-end, a much more specialized piece or procurement with a less specialized lower end IT services, that would be ripe for an improper bundling challenge. The government would try to justify it, and maybe in a certain circumstances could justify it, but I think you want to look at services that, and I love my analogies. So if the government's trying to buy, a Mercedes-Benz and a Toyota on the same RFP, that's where you want to look for bundling, because, lots of companies can provide a Toyota, very few companies can provide the Mercedes. And by putting the Toyota in with the Mercedes, they're taking that opportunity away from a lot of companies who could compete for it. And if we go all the way back to CICA, with the Competition and Contracting Act, the Competition and Contracting Act says you need to have maximized competition. So by taking several hundred small businesses off the street, by bundling a simple service in with a very robust, complex one, would be a CICA violation. At least that's how I would argue it. And there's a very good chance that that would be GAO would agree with something like that. So thank you for the question. It's nice to separate my train of thought. I wish we were live and I could hear you talk in person so I could take a break for a minute. So, all right. Other things to look for, we covered certifications and licenses, right? We understand if it's something you're working on or it's something that you can get between the bid and the submission, you should be able to challenge that. I don't have to have it. I should only have to prove that I'm in the process of getting it. And I've made that argument several times successfully. Sometimes it's taken bigger fights, but usually you can win and just get the government to agree, hey, as long as I can submit that I've got the application process pending, I should be able to submit my bid. Especially if it's a complex bid, we all know it's going to take the government at least a year to award it. So, we have time. When time's on your side, you can usually win the certification and licensing question. Okay, restrictive and specialized equipment. All right. Here is how the government always tries to steer something towards their preferred vendor or their preferred company. Okay, if they come in and say, not only do I need, this blade server, I need this blade server that's manufactured by this company and was built between October and November of 2019. Okay, obviously, that's extreme and a little bit crazy, but, if you see something along those lines that, says, hey, there's one company in the entire world who can meet that, that's overly restrictive and it's clearly designed to limit competition. So you want to you want to challenge that, and anything where, there's equipment and you need to be able to point to why the government specifications are not valid. If they say, hey, I want Dell computers because I like Dell computers, well, you know what? That's not really a reason. Hey, I want this type of server because that's what I have in my server room now. That's a little more justifiable, but as long as, but it's not, I'm not an IT specialist, but it's not it's not necessarily definitive. So again, keep your eye out. Like if you see something and you're like, man, I can't get that equipment. That's something you can challenge. If there's an equivalent product on the market, you can go back and challenge them and say, there's no reason for you to ask for, left-handed screwdrivers. A regular screwdriver works just as well. Okay. And the other thing with here, when we talk about equipment, specialized equipment, the other issue that crops up in this area is where the government specifications don't make sense. A great recent example I saw was firefighting equipment. Or a fire extinguisher. Hey, I want a fire extinguisher that is such and such a size with such and such a chemical in it. Well, maybe they don't make those. Maybe it's the chemical. Maybe the chemical only comes in other sizes, right? I mean, clearly that's a mistake on the government's part. But that's where we want to go back and say, hey, government, I think you have an error here. Or similarly, and that's another good opportunity on a restrictive equipment, right? Maybe there's 10 different types of fire extinguishers that have that type of chemical in it, but there's only one that has that certain size. That the government may be able to justify that, but that's a question worth bringing up and saying, hey, I can buy you this, which is 95% of what you're asking for. And it opens the door to let more bidders in. So again, pay close attention to the restrictive and specialized equipment. All right, you guys know your industry a lot better than I do. You will know when you look at an RFP and you read through an RFP whether or not it looks a little bit fishy and whether or not the government is asking for things or requirements that aren't necessary. And again, that's the time to bring this to an attorney, being an in-house or an outside counsel, and say, hey, I think we need to ping the government and challenge them on this. And again, a lot of times, you're very successful with just the firm but polite email on, I don't know if you're aware, but I think you're violating this or that provision by asking for this type of equipment. Unusual performance requirements is another issue, right? I'm trying to think of some good examples off the top of my head. I had some yesterday, but if they ask for weird hours of performance, if they ask you to, if it's a construction contract, and they want you to, hey, you're going to build this building, but you also got to go, necessarily landscape this other building across the facility. If they want you to put up some really, unusual type of outfacing on a building, something that just when you look at it, you scratch your head and you're like, huh, I don't understand that. And, and maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's a misunderstanding when whoever wrote the RFP put it together. But anything that just looks outside of the norm, if it's a standard government office building and they say, hey, you're bidding a contract for admin services and you need to cover 24/7, 365. Okay, wait a minute. If it's an administrative position in a general 9-to-5 office, why do I need to be there, that many hours? That's a possibility. So like I said, anything when you look at it and you look at the performance, and again, I know I keep saying this, but there's certain buzzwords that I always use to people when I'm telling them, what to look for. Anything that's a head scratcher in the technical side. Anything when you look at it as a technical expert in your field and you say, I don't understand what you're asking for, government, or hey, that looks really weird. I don't see why you're looking for those two things together. Those are all opportunities where you need to push back a little bit to the government. And we just got another question, Thomas. He says, for all these types of issues you're mentioning that are identified in the RFPs, is probably due to lack of subject matter expertise of the CEOs writing the RFPs. Do the CEOs welcome the issues raised by contractors that are oversights? And I would say absolutely. And actually, that's kind of right where I was just going. So good timing on your question. I would say on the technical side, it's one of two things. Either the government has who they want to write the RFP for in mind, and we all know this happens, and they're writing it that way and has got some weird things because that company can do those weird things. Or it's a oversight or misunderstanding on the government side because the person who's writing it isn't truly a technical expert, even though he's called the COTAR, and he doesn't fully understand what he's writing, not like the guys in industry who do it full time. I'd say probably at least 3/4 of the time it's the latter. Sometimes it's, hey, I have my incumbent I like, I have this company over here that I like, and I'm going to kind of let them shape it a little bit, which, we all try to do, right? The capture industry would be out of business if we didn't do that. But there's a way to do it, and there's a way to do it. And, there's a way to do it where you're doing it all square. And you're saying, hey, I have these capabilities, I want to be able to bid on your work. And it's another thing where you're trying to write it so narrowly, you're trying to steer it for somebody. So and that's a fine line to walk, and a lot of times the government steps over it. Generally, when you catch them at that, they will backtrack. Rarely do they stand and fight on that hill. As far as if they're technically inaccurate somewhere and there's a mistake, I found the government to be very, 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 very malleable, very, very helpful. Actually, they like it and view it as helpful when industry comes in and says, hey, I think there's a mistake in your RFP. You're asking for a left-handed screwdriver, and there's no such thing. Screwdrivers work in both directions, right? So that's again, I have my silly examples, but the government sometimes just doesn't fully understand the industry, and they will make mistakes. And again, it's like life. It depends on how you approach the government about their mistake is gonna have a lot of weight. If you come back like an authoritative jerk and tell the government, hey, you're full of crap, and this is a bunch of BS, this doesn't exist, you're not going to get the same reaction as if you come in and say, hey, I think there was an oversight here, you asked for this, this has been updated, this has been changed. I think you really meant to ask for this instead. Can you clarify? Very different approaches will get very different reactions from the government and the contracting officer. So again, there's a time to get nasty with the government. When you're in the Q&A and you're sending an email before a protest is generally not the time to get nasty. Even if you think the government's cheating, it plays a lot better for you to be the nice, reasonable guy at that time. So in addition to those specific things, when you're reading through an RFP, you want to look for stuff that's designed to restrict competition, right? I'm going to ask for a product that only 2 people sell. I'm going to ask for a product that has a very small pool of resellers, especially if it's if you're in a set-aside contract context where there's already a smaller pool of who can bid on it. And then if the government asks a little bit more, puts a little bit more restriction on there, it gets even more narrow. So look for that. Look very carefully for that kind of stuff. Look for stuff that's just generally ambiguous. It's like, I don't understand what you're asking for, and ask questions. One area where this comes up a lot is level of effort in a services contract, right? We need to understand the level of effort. How many trouble tickets are there a year in this help desk or this industry? How many man hours, how many man hours is this going to take? What are the specificities? A lot of times the government gives you, bupkis on that information, and you're really trying, and you have no idea how to scope your RFP, and you're trying to price it. And a lot of times that, again, the government just doesn't have the info. Sometimes, they like their incumbent. They want their incumbent to be able to bid it at a smart price. So something like that, that's a lack of information or ambiguous, is a very key area to focus on in a pre-award as you're pulling apart the RFP. Actually, I have a couple examples at the end of them here, and one of them is exactly on that issue. Was not giving enough information. Inconsistencies are another one. The government asked for one type of product under one CLIN. They asked for a different type of products, a different type of manufacturer of the same product in a different CLIN. They asked for services that don't really kind of mesh together. They look like they're leaving out something. Hey, you're asking us to come in and install this network, but you're not asking for the guys who need to come in and pull the cables. You're not asking for the guy who needs to come in and program the network. Is that and sometimes the government may have that service already or may have that product, but look for that as an inconsistency. Look to see if there's something where the government asks one thing and then asks for something else later. A lot of times RFPs are recycled, right? We all know that as well. So a lot of times these inconsistencies are just oversights. And again, this is why we want to go back to my initial steps, right? We want to start with the comments and then go to the Q&As and then go to an email and build up before we go to a protest. Because, a lot of times, especially in this area, back to Thomas's question, this is an area where it's simply a mistake. And probably 3/4 of the time it's a mistake. And if we get in early, we get in there and we can get it fixed. And I'm going to harken back to a point that I feel like I probably shouldn't make, but I will anyway. We need to pull these RFPs apart at a very detailed level very early in the process. These Q&As and these other questions and problems, I've oftentimes had clients, be it an internal or an external client, kind of come at the 11th hour because they didn't read the RFP closely enough and they missed something. They missed a certification or they missed a specification or they missed an inconsistency and we're running out of time and Q&A is closed. All right. So you don't want to be in that position where you can't ask a question and you have to jump to something a little more high stakes because you didn't examine the RFP too closely. Your licenses and certifications are probably one of the biggest issues where companies get tripped up and they somehow miss it. Or, if you're at a company where you have a proposal shop that writes a proposal and, the people who are the technical, they only read certain parts of the SOW, something gets missed until you're trying to write, final scrub and Q&A your proposal. And you realize, oh crap, I don't have this certification or I don't have somebody with this license, right? That's not the time to do it. I think everybody out here absolutely knows that. But it's a lesson I learned a couple of times as an in-house attorney. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was the details on Section C. And like I said, those are the ones, you guys are the experts on Section C, and you guys really know technically what's right, what's wrong. You can raise those issues with the government and address them yourself. When you start to get into sections L and M, that's where you want to look for maybe run things by an attorney or at least your contracts manager or somebody who understands kind of the contract side of things a little bit better. All right, section L, instructions to offers. All right, generally the only person who reads that is the proposal manager. Right? The person who's got to actually type it, submit it, get it all put together. Whoever is finalizing that issue is going to read the instructions to offerers. I would posit that other people need to read through it as well. You want to look for really weird things. Is the government asking for 25 copies shipped by binder, to the government for the evaluation? Okay, sometimes the government has a legitimate need for that. Sometimes they don't. That's a question you might want to ask, right? Especially if you're a small business, that gets very expensive when you got to do a whole bunch of binders, put them all together, print it all out, and then ship it. Okay, so that could be one. Hey, if there's instructions that, has email delivery, make sure it's got the time zone and the area where it's supposed to be on. All right. If I'm bidding, and I'm in California and it says 1600, make sure I got, is it Zulu time? Is it East Coast time? What time are you talking about? If the performance is going to be in Iraq, but the evaluation is going to take place in DC area, make sure you understand where the, what time they're talking about, and make sure it's clear. Anything again, and, this isn't so much protest issues as much as clarification issues, because you don't want to make a mistake when you submit for your proposal. So again, read very closely and detailed the instructions to offers. All right, and the other lesson learned that I've seen learned the hard way by multiple people: if your proposal needs to be received via email at 1300 on Tuesday afternoon, don't push send on email at 1258. Okay, send it in an hour early, and if possible, follow up with a phone call. I've had clients who've hit send and got a read receipt from the server, but it never got to the end user and didn't get there in time. There's GAO case law that says it's your responsibility to make sure it gets to beyond the server and all the way to who's supposed to get it. Okay, read receipts, obviously, if it's an email submission, are absolutely imperative. And usually the government, when it's a proposal, are very good about accepting the read receipt piece. So make sure you do that. And again, don't wait to the last minute. All right. There's gamesmanship on submitting your stuff. You want to make sure you get it in. If the government comes out with an extension at the last minute and you ship yours off the day before via FedEx, you got to make sure you get it recalled. I understand all those things, but I've seen several clients miss opportunities because they waited to the last minute and either had an email error or some other such, and they didn't get it in on time. I'm not telling anyone something they don't know. The system is absolutely draconian. When they say bids have to be received at 1300, that does not mean 1300 in 1 second. That means 1300 or earlier. And I look at it, I learned as a very young Marine Corps officer, if you're not 3 minutes early, you're late. So apply that to your proposal submissions. And I'd say if you're not an hour early, you're probably late. I know we all like to write to the very last minute, but definitely get it in time that you can make any sudden adjustments if there's a problem. You don't want to be the proposal manager explaining to your CEO that you missed the proposal deadline because you emailed it in too late, because you'd probably be cleaning out your desk that afternoon. So again, that's and it sounds like, of course I know that. I've had multiple clients who've gotten issues where the emails weren't received and they sent it too late to realize that and weren't able to correct it. So instructions to offers is super vitally important. And if you mess it up, you have almost no recourse. So when you're going to read it very closely, very detailed. Give yourself plenty of time to adjust. I think I beat that horse to death, but it's an important horse to beat. Next slide, please. Okay, section M, evaluation factors. I think probably 75 to 80% of the pre-award protests that I have filed have been along evaluation factors. And I don't think I'm alone when I say the most common pre-award protest. This is also the one where, other than maybe the certifications and licenses, this is the one where a bidder or offerer is most likely going to accidentally waive their protest argument. Because a lot of times, you'll look through something, and when you read through it the first time, okay, it makes sense. And you go ahead and submit a bid, and then you get evaluated, and you come back and you're like, oh, you didn't evaluate me right. And when you go back and read the RFP, Yeah, they did. You're taking issues not with how they did it, or not with what they did, but how they did it. And the how they did it needs to be brought up in the pre-award context. So you got to be very careful. If you read an evaluation criteria and it's anything other than, A, B, C decision, read it closely and thoroughly. And if it's confusing at all, run it past an attorney to take a quick look at it. If you send me an RFP and say, hey, can you look at this RFP and read through my evaluation criteria and let me know what you think about it? That's probably 15 to 20 minutes of work on my part, which, is about $100. And, that is money very well spent, because if there's an issue with it and you were going to submit a bid under that issue and you lost because of that issue, you're done. You can't challenge it later. So, when I talk about, a lot of lawyers are like, oh, call me, I'll do this. I understand, and believe me, I often had to justify outside counsel bills to my CEOs. I understand the process, and but there's certain times money is worth spending. I think we all know the expression, an ounce of prevention. This is definitely an ounce of prevention. Now, a lot of you guys have probably read hundreds of RFPs, if not hundreds, at least dozens or scores, if we, so you know how to read an evaluation criteria, and I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence. I'm just going to say that if something looks, again, and, when I stress points, I try to keep it to the simple common denominator. If something doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. And if you don't understand the evaluation criteria and you need to read it 4 or 5 times to try to clarify it, chances are there's a problem. So that should be your first clue of a red flag that you want to clarify something. Okay, and on the issue of evaluations, there's you'll hear ambiguity and you'll hear latent and patent ambiguities. Okay, and we talked about ambiguities earlier under the technical side. And latent and patent ambiguity becomes an issue of timeliness for protest. A latent ambiguity means there's something wrong with the proposal and the way it was going to be evaluated, but it wasn't clear on the face of the proposal. It was latent. It was dormant. It wasn't until I got my debrief that I realized this was a problem. Okay, that's a latent ambiguity, and you can protest a latent ambiguity after award. So if you get evaluated and you're like, I didn't know you were going to do that, and I didn't know this was a requirement, and or I didn't know you required XYZ product, and if it's not clear in the solicitation, it's a latent ambiguity. It could also be an unstated evaluation criteria. But again, if you're saying, hey, this was ambiguous and I didn't understand you were going to do it that way, that's a latent ambiguity that you can bring up post award. So again, I know I'm beating the drum of timeliness with pre-award, but that's if somebody comes up with an evaluation and you read the evaluation criteria and you go back and see how you were evaluated, and it wasn't clear that they were going to do it that way, then you can still protest that at the end. A patent ambiguity is just it's patent. It's right there in your face when you read it. It's ambiguous on, hey, I'm going to use this color scheme, and I'm going to use red, white, blue, purple, and pink is higher than purple, but purple is lower than yellow, and red is higher than yellow. And if it gets all that, and you're like, wait, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand what you're doing. That's a patent ambiguity, and that's the one that needs to be challenged up front. Okay, so evaluation factors and evaluation criteria are very important to read. And I think I have can you go to the next slide, because I think I have more on it there. Yes. Okay. So as we get into the evaluation factors and we talk about latent or patent ambiguity, we want to look at their evaluation method. All right, you want to look at how they're evaluating, and and cost price evaluations and technical evaluations. cost and price sometimes tend to be the ones that are most difficult and where the ambiguities and problems come. Technical is usually on the technical side, it's understandable how they're going to evaluate you. I've got these 3 factors, and I'm going to evaluate you based on these factors, and I'm going to give you either a score, or I'm either going to give you a color scheme, or I'm going to give you a average or outstanding, or a number, and then I'm going to add up your factors, and highest score wins. Okay, or the highest score before we get to the best value trade-off. So technical evaluations, are usually a little more clear, and you can understand them. Again, though, if you can't, or there's a technical evaluation where they're saying they're going to evaluate you on something, but that's not part of the technical requirement, maybe, we'll go back to, I'm going to evaluate you on whether or not you have a CMMI, and I'm going to offer you points for this. But nowhere in it is a CMMI certification required. All right. I mean, that can be an ambiguous type issue or an unreasonable evaluation. Why are you adding points for something that's not required for the solicitation? On a technical side, or I'm going to evaluate certain technical specifications, and it just management approach, and they get into management approach and they go beyond what they say they're going to go beyond. All right, if they tell you they're going to look at X and Y in your management approach, but they look at X, Y, and Z, okay, then that's a problem. That's a latent ambiguity. Okay, so we can challenge that there. So again, on the technical side, that's really something that I think you guys, as the technical experts in your field, can look at and understand when you're reading through an evaluation factors. And again, on the for a technical evaluation, if you cannot understand the technical evaluation factors and how it's going to be done, that's the time to elevate it and go back to the government. Okay, price or cost is a lot of times where the evaluation methods can be really, really unclear, really ambiguous, and really just kind of messy, right? I mean, especially if it's a firm fixed price bid and you got to include all this stuff, okay, maybe that's not so, that's kind of easy. You could have a challenge for that, though, if the government says, hey, I have a plug number, and the plug number is kind of unrealistic and underscopes some things and is forcing you to move costs from that plug number to somewhere else, all right, or it's unclear what the plug number covers, right? That can be an issue even with a firm fixed price. But if it's an IDIQ pricing one with a sample task order, if it's a buying products or goods, or you're trying to get on a vehicle and you're trying to get a bunch of they're going to evaluate prices of a bunch of different items, that's a place where it can get very confusing. Are you going to evaluate? Maybe they're only going to evaluate a bundle of items. Maybe there's a process during your bid where you've got to bid in discounts to the government, and the government says, hey, these discounts are going to apply at these trigger points. Do you price those in with the discounts, or do you price in the non-discounted? If there's a discounts in there and it doesn't say in the price whether you're supposed to not use them or use them, you need to make sure you understand that. And if they're saying we're not going to apply it, but you don't think that's right, and that's going to give you the government an incorrect price, you want to go back and challenge them on that and say, hey, you need to look at the discounted price, government, because that's what you're really going to pay. Because if you do it the other way, you're going to allow people to game the system. All right. And whether it be on balance pricing, and that's another issue on price or costs. If you look at something and you say, hey, your price evaluation scheme is going to really kind of encourage on-balance pricing, and on-balance pricing is a problem, because it leads to a misleading result. You want to be able to challenge it, at this point in time when you're looking at the evaluation method. So, make sure you fully understand how you're going to be evaluated. Make sure you understand the process and it's clear how the government's going to go from A to Z and the path that they're going to take to get there. If it's not, you need to ask questions. And if the government refuses to answer these questions is when you need to up the pressure. Because again, if something's unclear and you don't, and it can be read in, unclear means if I look at an evaluation scheme and I can read it to mean either A or B, and A and B are both kind of legitimate ways to read it, right? That's the definition of ambiguous. I can't just assume that it's going to be A because A makes a little bit more sense. If B is a valid way to read it, you need to ask the question up front, because on the backside that would be determined as a patent ambiguity, and you would lose the ability to protest that. So again, look very closely at evaluation factors. Make sure it makes sense. All right, and then it can't be unreasonable, irrational, or result in a misleading results. All right, unreasonable is if you're not super fantastic across the board, you can't get the contract. If I'm going to set specifications that are so high that there's no way, maybe one company can reach it, that's a little bit unreasonable. If they put parameters on there, if past performance, okay, if you have no past performance, you're supposed to be by far a neutral rated. And if the government comes back and says, if you have no past performance, I'm going to give you a negative rating, right? Not only is that unreasonable, that's illegal. That's against the FAR. They can't do that. Look for something that there's no way that you're going to get a proper evaluation by doing this. One that's irrational. Hey, you're going to provide me 100 different items, to the commissary or to, some other, supply schedule that I'm going to buy off of. I'm going to evaluate you off of 10, but I don't pick the 10 most bought items. I pick the 10 most expensive, or I pick the 10 cheapest. And there's really no rhyme or reason for how I picked my 10 items I'm going to evaluate you on. All right, that's one you want to make sure you say, hey, that's kind of irrational, because 60% of the items that are going to be purchased aren't even in your evaluation basket. Okay, that's that would be the definition of an irrational, and is going to lead to a misleading result, because if I'm only going to buy 30% of my purchase is going to be on those items, the prices of those items are not really important to the entire cost of the RFP. Excuse me for a second. So again, on evaluation methods, they can't be unreasonable, they can't be irrational, and they can't result in a misleading result. They can't end up in a misleading results. And again, I keep harping back to this, and I always talk to clients and say, listen, you can tell me better than I can tell you if this pricing scheme makes sense. Explain it to me. And, that's often, if you're the CEO or boss and you're not sure on it, ask your pricer to explain it to you, and make sure your pricer is explaining it to you in a way that makes sense and you can understand. And if he explains it to you in a way that you don't see, that you don't agree with, then, that could be that alone could be ambiguous, right? So if you got 2 or 3 people in your company and you're all reading it differently, that should be a very good sign that you got an ambiguous evaluation method, and you need to clarify it, and if you can't get clarification, challenge it. So I think I jumped up and down on evaluation factors, and actually, I know we were booked for 2 hours. I probably only got about 10 or 15 more minutes, so hopefully you folks have some more questions. Because and if nothing else, think about areas where I might have went a little bit more quickly, and you'd like to go back and redo it. Oftentimes you put together, when I put together classes, I always think of in-person audiences, and there's a lot more back and forth and discussion. And I keep failing to factor in on a webinar. There's usually a lot less back and forth and discussion, so I need to add about 5 more slides to my presentation. So I apologize that we, that we're going to run shorter than the allotted time, but that's because I'm not getting enough Q&A. So I'm actually going to blame it on the audience. I don't think I'm supposed to do that, but so think of some questions to hit me with. But again, on evaluation factors, I think I think I beat that horse pretty thoroughly. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, actually, I do have 2 more slides. So, again, more on evaluation factors, because clearly I didn't hit it as thoroughly as I thought I did. Ambiguous evaluation criteria, right? We've all seen scoring systems. We've seen rating systems. We've seen color systems. Make sure it's clear. Make sure it understands that in order to get an outstanding, what does it mean, right? Don't let it be open for interpretation. Does outstanding mean I have, clearly I have no weaknesses. I definitely have no deficiencies, but does it say how many strengths I have to have? How many exceptional strengths? Is there a definition of outstanding? Push to get a definition of outstanding, and have it up front, because we don't necessarily understand what outstanding is. Outstanding to me might be, you need to have, you need to have 3 or 4 strong strengths out there, exceptionally good things in your proposal. Maybe you're thinking you just need to have everything, no weaknesses and 1 or 2 strengths. So if the government doesn't define what equals outstanding, what equals good, what equals average, that's a good time to ask. You may not get that, and the government technically doesn't have to give you to a full level of detail. But I will use what what I told my teenage son. It never hurts to ask, because you never know what kind of mood I'm going to be in. All right. So, hey, can I borrow the car? Sometimes I'm going to say no. Sometimes I'll say yes. If you want to know what I call outstanding, go ahead and ask me, and maybe I'll explain it to you. Maybe I won't. So again, you don't necessarily, if it doesn't say, doesn't mean you can protest, but try to get as much detail as you can, right? And I'm talking, and this time I'm giving you advice on how to handle a post-award protest, because the more details you can get to box the government in on an evaluation and how they're going to evaluate and how they're going to score, the less wiggle room the government has on the backside. And if they identify outstanding means you have 3 strengths and and a couple of exceptionals, right? 3 strengths and at least 1 exceptional. All right. At the backside, that if people don't have that, then they couldn't be rated as outstanding. So you want to get detail. The most detail you can push to get from the government here works. Understand the scoring and rating systems. Understand what the colors are. I haven't seen a color scheme one in a while. I don't know if the government's moving away from that. But I used to see color schemes like blue, red, green, whatever the colors were. And it wasn't very clearly delineated between blue and green. Make sure you're understanding, and you can really box in what's outstanding, what's very good, what's good, what's acceptable. Make sure you understand how they compare the factors. All right, 99% of the time, or maybe 90% of the time, you're going to see that in an RFP. Management approach is as important as technical approach. Taken together, both are more important than past performance. All 3 together are significantly more important than pricing. Okay, we've all seen that. But the scenario I just gave you is a little bit ambiguous of where past performance stands compared to technical and management approach. So, make sure you understand when you're looking at how they're comparing, and make sure it makes sense, and make sure you understand it. As a guy who writes for a living a lot, sometimes you write something, and when you write it, it's not as clear as you think it is. So a lot of times the government's going to write an evaluation criteria. They're going to think it's very clear. You're going to see it, and it's not going to be very clear. So make sure, don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions on clarifications on the evaluation systems. Make sure you understand how the factors are compared relative to each other. Make sure there's a tie-in with how it's going to all compare back to pricing. Okay, so make sure you get this. And the more detail you can get the government to put down up front, the better off you are on the backside if you want to challenge how the government rated you or how they rated the awardee if the awardee is not you. Or, you know, how it can protect you if you are the awardee. So I got a couple questions here, Mary Beth. Yours on timing. I will get to timing on stuff at the end. And as we finish up, I may ask you to come on verbally and ask your question because I don't fully understand it. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, we can go back and let me go through the questions before I jump into the examples. So Anne, your question is advise about getting feedback debriefs on RFIs. I don't know if I'd use the term debrief. I think you can use feedback, right? An RFI is still pre-solicitation. A pre-solicitation, until the solicitation hits the street, you can always talk to the government. So when you put in an RFI, you know, and you can go to the government a week later, 2 weeks later, and follow up via phone call. If you've got a capture person, that's what they should be doing. And if they're not doing it, stuff like that, get a new capture person. Right? RFIs are just, the government's trying to get information. And it doesn't mean, you know, the only time the government can no longer talk to you is when the solicitation is published. All the way up until the day before, you can talk to the contracting officer and you can talk to the government and you can have discussions with them about your capabilities and their needs, and maybe telling them, I don't think you need what you think you need. I think you need this instead. Okay, there's a lot of people who work capture in the federal space who make a lot of money and a very good living because they are excellent at that and they're worth every penny of what they're being paid. So, you know, during the RFI process, don't use an RFI is not a fire and forget missile. All right, it's one you got to constantly aim. The government may not want to talk to you. They may say, hey, we've got our info, we're going, but you can always reach out to them and ask. And you can even couch it as, hey, I submitted my RFI and I want to get your thoughts on it to see if I answered your question. All right, see if I answered your question and your needs and maybe if I addressed it correctly. You know, the government is usually a lot more willing to address hey, did I give you what you need? I want to make sure I'm helping you out and giving you the right stuff than, hey, let me give you my company sales pitch. Okay, so again, words matter, techniques and the angles that you bring to words matter. But yes, so Ann, I think I answered your question. As I wrap up here, we can unmute people, and if I didn't, please feel free to ask it again in person. Prashant says, too late to ask questions if the Q&A period is over. Technically, yes, but that's only technically. If you find something in an RFP and you can point out an ambiguity and a problem, and you go to the government and say, hey, listen, I know Q&A is over, but I just saw this and I just noticed this issue and I think this is a problem. I don't want to have to file a pre-award protest, but if we don't get it fixed, I'm going to have to. All right. And, you paint yourself as I'm the reasonable good guy and I see a problem with your RFP and I don't want to, be the bad guy. Can we fix it before I have to protest? So technically, you're not supposed to take Q&As afterwards. So if you're asking for a clarification on a technical thing, you're probably not going to get a response from the government. If you're asking for an issue where you see something ambiguous or unclear in the solicitation, that's a legitimate pre-award protest grounds, chances are you'll get a response. And the other chances are if the government gets a whole bunch of questions even after the Q&A period is over, they very well may reopen Q&A and say, hey, we're going to publish more answers and extend the solicitation deadline. And quite frankly, if you've got a whole bunch of questions that still haven't been answered, you can find a pre-award protest ground just on utter confusion or lack of clarity in the RFP. Again, the RFP's got to be clear, and it's got to give you a fair opportunity to bid it. And if there's a whole bunch of technical problems in there that the government's never answered and the Q&As are closed, you know, you have an opportunity to you may have a pre-award protest grounds on that. All right. So Mary Beth, your question was on, can I discuss the timing for bringing protests and clarifications pre-submission and post-award? I will go ahead and do that. So sorry, I've been talking, you know, when you talk for 75 straight minutes, you start to get a little punch drunk. So I apologize if I repeat myself and get tongue tied here a little bit. So pre-award protest, if you are challenging the solicitation in the solicitation, if I'm looking at the solicitation and I say, that's wrong, government, you're refusing to fix it, here's my protest. Okay, that has to be before, if proposals are due at 1300 on Tuesday, your protest needs to be a GAO by 12:59 on Tuesday. Okay, and ideally earlier, so you can also notify the contracting officer, but it's got to be submitted before proposals are due. Now, if you've reached an impasse with the government, don't wait to the last minute, because again, like I said, you've got to submit your proposal as well in order to be an interested offerer. So if you submit your proposal a week or so in advance, you may be able to avoid having to go through the final expense of finishing a proposal based on how the government reacts once you put your proposal out there. They may stay, you know, they may extend it and stop the whole solicitation for a pre-award protest. So, and while it's completely off topic, I actually will cover post-award protest timelines. Because when you're an attorney who works in the protest world, you know, timelines make you very, very nervous, and it gets very confusing. And actually, the enhanced debriefing issue has made it even more confusing for clients. So we're going to start with FAR Part 15. FAR Part 15 allows you to get a debrief automatically after the notice of award. So when the notice of award comes out, you have 3 days to request a debrief. You should do it within 3 minutes. Maybe not 3 minutes. In your request for a debrief, you want to ask specific questions. Don't just say, I want a debrief. You want to say, I want a debrief. Can the government clarify how it came up with my technical rating of acceptable? Can the government, provide, can the government explain how it changed my pricing for evaluation purposes? You want to ask specific questions in your debrief when you request it. That's not as important today as it was a few years ago because of the enhanced debriefing. So you have your debrief, you have to request your debrief. You have your debrief, you have to request it within 3 days. The government's got a couple of days to come back and schedule your debrief. Debriefs, if 15 people bid, the debriefs may take a while to get through. When you get your debrief, you have the right to ask what's called enhanced debriefing questions. This is somewhat new. I want to say the 2018 NDAA put this in, where you get to go, hey, government, I don't understand what you did on my debrief. Can you answer X and Y? You want to be very, very detailed in those questions. That's a very good time to get your attorneys involved. I've written these post-award debrief questions multiple times because you want to, I will speak as a litigating attorney, you want to box the government in and you want to use certain words and phrases where they don't have a lot of wiggle room. So it's important to ask your questions the right way. The government then has 48 hours. I got to go back. The government then can come back and answer you with a written response. The minute you receive the written response to your enhanced debriefing questions, your debrief is closed and your protest clock starts running. So even if you go back to the government and say, I don't understand your answer, can you answer it again? Okay, this was just decided recently at GAO. Government answered questions, contractor asked, government answered again. The contractor used the second answer as its protest clock start, and GAO said they were untimely. So if you do an enhanced debrief and you get the government's answer, your clock starts then. You have 5 days from the close of your debrief to file your protest to get the automatic CICA stay of performance. 5 days. And here's where it gets confusing, right? So your protest, you have your debrief, you have your questions, you get your answers, you file within 5 days. The government has to, by law, stop performance on the contract. You have 10 days from the close of your debrief to file your protest and let it be timely at GAO. So, if you come in on day 6, you can still file your protest. Now, the government does not have to cease performance if the protest is filed on day 6 through 10. Practically, the government will almost always cease performance of the awarded contract because they don't want to award a contract and get 2.5 months into performance and then you win your protest and then they have to go back, right? So even though technically you don't automatically get a CICA stay, chances are you will get the stay for practical purposes. Okay, so again, notice of award, 3 days for debrief. You have your debrief, 2 days for questions. Government answers your questions, your clock starts. From when your clock starts, day 5 gets you to file your protest for CICA, automatic CICA stay. Day 10 for the timely with GAO. Now that's GAO. Everybody likes to protest at GAO, including me, because it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier. If you miss your deadline, and this is a $150 million contract award, you can go to the Court of Federal Claims, because the Court of Federal Claims, you have 1 year from when you found out of your contract, your grounds of protest, to file your protest. I will tell you, I could probably do a GAO protest all the way through from filing the protest to finishing it up for under $20,000. It's going to be 3 or 4 times, if not 5 times that much, if I have to go to the Court of Federal Claims. So that's why people would rather do a GAO protest than a Court of Federal Claims protest. And honestly, protest, if it's a simple protest, it's a lot cheaper even than that. I'm not going to quote you anything because then have you call me and say, you said you could do my protest for $5,000. Not going to play name that tune quite that strictly. But the price is, Court of Federal Claims is at least 4 or 5 times more expensive than GAO. So you really need to, if it's not a big contract, I will tell you very closely, I will urge you not to take it to GAO or take it to the Court of Federal Claims due to cost. And Mary Beth, you beat me to my question. I interrupted myself. I started with FAR Part 15. FAR Part 8 is a totally different animal, because under FAR Part 8, you do not rate a debrief. So the government, even if they do, if they're doing a BPA off of the supply schedules, and it's listed under FAR Part 8, but it looks and smells like a FAR Part 15, they still do not have to give a debrief. You need to look very carefully and see what it says, because it should say, this solicitation is being issued under FAR Part 8. So it may look like and smell like, a FAR Part 15 bid, but it's not, which means you'll request a debrief and the government won't respond because they don't have to respond. And I just dealt with this issue with a client about 5 weeks ago. He came to me and said, hey, this happened. They, the government picked an awardee that was 26% higher. And, even though there were no weaknesses, no other problems with my client's proposal, so he was at least, acceptable, if not to good. The government said, hey, we're going to go with the incumbent who's 26% higher. And he requested a debrief, and the government was silent. And this is where I get a little bit angry with the government, because they play games. So the government was silent because they were hoping you would accidentally run out the clock on yourself, waiting for the government to respond. And then you ping them again a week later, like, hey, I asked a debrief, you never responded. Well, yeah, guess what? Too bad, you're not going to get a debrief and you're now out of time. You know, the government should say, hey, this is FAR Part 8. We're not going to have debriefs. So you know there's not a debrief, but they play games. So FAR Part 8, forget everything I said about debriefs because you're not going to get one. You're going to have to, or if you get one, the government will offer it to you after your protest window is closed. So your protest window starts from the notice of award. So you have 5 days from notice of award under FAR Part 8 to file your protest for seek a stay, and you have 10 days to be timely at GAO. So, you know, Part 8 and Part 15, where people run into problems with this, you know, we generally know Part 8 when it looks like and smells like a Part 8. Give me a quote off the schedule. But when it's a BPA, people sometimes forget you're not going to get a debrief. So that's where the difference is out there between those two. And you know, since we had some extra time, I figured it was a good good segue to cover the protest timelines. Because frankly, I've had to tell too many clients in my career that they missed their window for their protest. And it's really frustrating, especially if the client or potential client got screwed by the government. You know, it's kind of heartbreaking to say we can't do this, and you know, since it's a $250,000 contract, you don't want to pay me to take it to the Court of Federal Claims. I mean, those are miserably painful conversations to have with your client because they didn't pick up the phone and call you early enough. So my advice to every single person out there, if you lose, and this isn't just because I'm trying to drum up business, it's because I me and every other attorney out there who does this, we really feel for our clients, and we want to make sure you protect your rights and your deadlines. So as soon as you get a notice of a notice of award and it's not you, if you have an attorney you use, you should reach out to them. You're allowed to have your attorney on your debrief call if you want. You need to tell the government before let them know. You can't just have the attorney show up because if you bring your lawyer, they got to bring theirs. But you definitely, if you look at it and you're like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, we talk about money worth spending. I can write a much, much better protest for you if I'm involved in your debrief. And I can write a much better protest for you if I write your enhanced debriefing questions. So, I know I know we're not cheap. And I know that, people hate spending money on lawyers if they don't think they've got a great case. But honestly, you're talking, an hour or two of my work. It can make the difference between having a protest we can win and one we lose. If you're going to double down with the protest money, get your lawyers involved earlier instead of later. If you have an in-house counsel, you absolutely need them involved in every single one of these. They should be on every debrief call, and they should be reviewing and writing your debrief questions. So that's post-award protest, completely off topic, but important stuff to follow. The use of GSA schedule of services RFP protestable by companies not on the schedule. Mr. or Miss Gates, you cannot protest unless you are an interested party. So if you're not on the schedule and you feel like you can sell the product as good as people on the schedule, you're not going to win that protest. If you want to bring an argument and saying that this really shouldn't be on a schedule because the government's piecing together pieces from here, there, and the other place, and it's not appropriate, or it's expanding the scope, or it's bringing in non-scheduled goods as well, that you can protest, okay? But if it's hey, I want to bid this, and they're putting it out under the schedule, unless it's somehow, unless you can challenge the scope of the protest, you're not going to be able to challenge the protest under the schedule. Remember, the government wants to use the schedule. The laws and rules and regs are written to encourage the government to use the schedules because it's cheaper, it's faster, and it's more efficient. So it's very tough row to hoe to protest something being on a schedule and saying, no, it shouldn't be on that schedule, right? The same with an IDIQ contract. Hey, that task order, hey, this is my contract that I'm doing. You shouldn't be moving it to an IDIQ contract that I don't have. We can debate the merits of how fair that is, but we can't debate whether the government has the legal right to do that. And that's another painful conversation to have. Because you could be an incumbent and all of a sudden your work gets moved to a task order under an IDIQ that you can't bid. And then you're stuck reducing your work from what you have to 49% of it is the sub to somebody who's got the vehicle. So those are difficult protests. They're rare to be successful, but they are possible. I hope I answered your question. And I saw your comment. My contact info is at the end of the slide. Maybe we can connect. We can connect via telephone or email, and you can talk me through that a little bit. We have a policy at my law firm. Consultations are free. So if you have just a 10-minute question, we could have that conversation, and I'm not going to ask you to sign a letter and pay me money up front. If it gets to 11 minutes, we'll have to talk, though. Just kidding. Can you go back one slide? We got completely off topic. But okay, so I had a couple of examples I wanted to cover on pre-award protests to show you exactly how they work and how they're real world. And one of them, you'll notice one of them was May 5th, 2020, okay? The first one, Raymond Express International, 2014, this is a commissary bid, right? I was shopping in the commissary yesterday, very nice place. The commissary, this is similar to what I was talking about in the discussions. There's when you're a supplier, the commissary, for those of you who don't know, the commissary is the supermarket for the Department of Defense, right? That's our grocery store on base. So, if you're supplying a commissary, you're providing, a bucket of goods, especially if you're doing it overseas, right? So, hey, I'm gonna bid on all the produce for the commissary in Guam. You're gonna submit pricing on 100 different items. The government is gonna then pick a bundle of items and evaluate you generally on that. That's generally how those work. So in this case, the government said, hey, you're gonna apply this and that discount as I buy from you. But the government was not going to use the discounted pricing as far as pricing evaluation. The protester said, hey, that's unreasonable, and that's going to give you a completely misleading result. I might have a broker that I got a huge volume discounts on that's going to give me, and that's what you'll actually pay. You're not paying it's like buying a car. Nobody pays sticker price. So you shouldn't be evaluating sticker price when we all know you're not paying sticker price. That's the extent of what the evaluation or the argument was, and the protester won. The government found, or the GAO found that the pricing evaluation criteria was unreasonable, and they had to go back to the drawing board and price with the discounts. So that's a real world successful pre-award protest. ASRC is Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. For those of you who aren't familiar with Alaska Native Corps. All right, the ASRC you'll see all over the place. They have a lot of subsidiaries, all working in 8A and hub zone spaces. So they bid an IT contract, right? And we talked about level of efforts. So the PWS has a level of effort that was very, and this one was very ambiguous, very bland, I would say, for lack of better words, right? Not enough detail. They couldn't bid it. They're like, how do I know, how many technicians do I bid if you're not telling me how many trouble tickets I'm going to have, right? I mean, I can count your computers, but I don't know your network. You've got historical data. You know how many trouble tickets there are. You need to give me this data so I can submit an informed bid. All right, this is a perfect example on the technical side where pre-award protests are really work. Hey, government, you're not giving me enough information to be able to submit a accurate, timely, and fair bid. And one of the two of us is going to get hosed here, and it's probably going to be me. All right, we'd say it in a little more, fluent legal language, but that's basically what we're arguing, right? You like your incumbent, you want your incumbent to bid it, so you're not going to tell me. So you're going to be able to tell me, evaluate me at the end of the day and say I either understaffed or I overbid, right? So give me more details. That's in a nutshell of what this protest was, and you can tell, for those of you who don't know how they number protests. So the more people who jump on a protest, and the more, if you've never done a protest before, you submit a protest, the government gives you the record, you look through the record and you find 5 more things that the government did wrong, and you submit additional protests. And the more that goes back and forth, the numbers keep going up. You'll see the .4, the .5, the .7. So this was a very complicated back and forth protest. It was done by Crowell and Mooring, which is one of the big government contract firms. And I think they had like 8 lawyers working on this thing. So this was a complicated one, but the issue basically came down to the government did not give me enough info to submit a fair bid. And the protester won. This protest was sustained. So, I mean, pre-award protests work. They work better if you use the process, go through it, start up front, because whether GAO is supposed to, take into account that you asked questions and gave comments ahead of time, it's going to impact GAO's interpretation. If the government, if they find the government, they're more likely to find the government being unreasonable if the contractor was reasonable and the government refused to respond. So, go through the process if you can. The question came in earlier, like, hey, I found something as I was writing the RFP. That's not unusual. So sometimes you can't help it, but just make sure you're clear about what happened. You want to go down the process. These pre-award protests will work. Like I said, there's a steps to how to get it to work. And again, getting attorneys involved to help you write questions when it involves evaluation criteria is a good idea. I know what I would argue on protest, so I know what I need to accuse the government of when I write a question. So when the government reads the question, they're going to understand that, oh, these people are watching well enough to know that they're going to protest me if I don't fix this. So, that's a good reason to make sure you're getting the right kind of wording and terminology in your Q&As and your communications with the government. And again, like I said earlier, the email from the lawyer with the lawyer's signature block often gets a little bit more attention. Generally, when a lawyer reaches out to the government, the contracting officer is going to involve the agency counsel. I will tell you from longstanding experience, when you see the agency take corrective action very quickly under a protest, that means the agency screwed up and the agency counsel wasn't involved until the protest was filed, right? If the agency counsel gets involved and comes in and closes the door and tells the contracting officer, you messed this up 9 ways from Sunday and you need to fix it, that happens a lot. So when you see very rapid corrective action, that's what that means. But what that means on the Q&A and the sending an email to the government on the front side is, if the government's really wrong, but the contracting officer is being obstinate, getting an email from a lawyer that then brings in agency counsel may help break a logjam where the government is just being driven by a difficult personality. Hey, I love protests. I like fighting with the government. I can bill a whole bunch of hours. My clients can win protests and be very happy and love me forever. But if I can resolve your issue with an email to the government that you pay me a lot less money on, we both go home happy. So I like being upstream. One of the reasons I love being an in-house counsel is I was always upstream. I was never downstream. I got tired of dealing with one client all the time, which is why I'm back in a law firm. But I will tell you guys all, please reach out ahead of time. But reach out a few days before you think you need to call the lawyer. I may be able to help solve the problems earlier. Last question here from sorry if it's Mr. or Miss Gates. Is there any advantage to filing a protest with the agency versus with GAO? 9 times out of 10, I will tell you agency protests are not worth the paper they're printed on. You know, you're going to the same contracting officer that you've necessarily been dealing with this whole time. That's who's going to decide the agency protest. Chances are you're not going to go get anywhere. This is the whole thing about whether you should file an REA versus a claim. Okay. There's times where agency protests are appropriate, even if you're not going to win, just because you're trying to send a message and a signal. And maybe you're not going to protest a GAO, but you want to tell the government that you're getting sick of their games. There's strategic reasons to do an agency protest. Rarely do I see agency protests succeeding unless the government made some like absolutely crazy flawed evaluation thing and they need to go back to fix it. The problem is the government's got to admit its mistake to itself at that level. And it's a lot easier for them to say that GAO found out I made a mistake. I didn't know I made the mistake. You know, and again, it's kind of silly, you know, but you can point out to the agency, hey, you made this mistake and I have X and Y and it's right there in my proposal and you didn't read it. The government very often is not going to change its mind, even when you try to confuse them with facts. So yes, there's a time and a place for an agency protest. You know, I find them generally not to be successful, but that doesn't mean you should never bring it. And I advise clients for agency protests, it's more of a strategic decision than I'm going to win here and end it this much quicker. So I think I answered your question. If not, feel free to shoot a second one. And everybody, I think I've scrolled through and I think I've hit all the questions. And I appreciate the questions, everybody, and I appreciate even us going off topic. We can go to the last slide now, so everybody can write down my my contact info and hire me for all their legal matters. So, just kidding on that, kind of. But again, I meant what I say. You know, General Counsel, we're a small firm out of McLean. We have about 10 lawyers. But all of us have either government or big law firm experience. I worked at big law firms the first 8 years of my career. I was general counsel for several companies, including one that had 1.2 billion in revenue. So, you know, the fact that I'm working at a small law firm office doesn't mean I didn't swim in the deep end of the pool. Me and my colleagues at General Counsel, we like working with small businesses, which is why we're where we are, because I have rates that you can afford. If I was at a big law firm, small businesses couldn't afford me. Small businesses are more fun and dynamic, and I can move the needle for you guys a lot more than I can for Jacobs or Lockheed Martin. And my colleagues will tell you the same thing. So I tell my clients, you're really getting me at a discount. My billable rate is probably 30% lower than it was when I was at a big law firm. So, you know, it's, we're there, we have the capabilities. We're not quite full service, but we're getting close. You know, we've got really good employment lawyers. We've got some very good, excellent litigators. If you're in the DC metro or area or Virginia, Maryland, you know, we've got government contracts, obviously, and we've got some very good corporate attorneys. So if you're doing M&A, you know, smaller M&A deals, probably up to $4 or $5 million, we can cover you for all that stuff, and we're a lot cheaper than the big firms. So I appreciate this opportunity, Vaughn. Thank you so much for the invitation and letting me talk. Everybody, I said, if you have any questions or follow-ups, feel free to reach out. Again, no charge for a consultation. You know, I look at it as the loss leader. If you give me, if I can spend 5 minutes on a phone call with you and give you good advice and help you out, and not charge you for it, I'm confident you'll call me in the future when you need you need payable legal advice. So everyone, best of luck. Any questions? I hope this was helpful. Any feedback or questions you give to Vaughn, if you think it was something I should have covered and I didn't, I would appreciate it, because I'll do this for other people at other times. And, you know, I always like to know what the audience likes to hear and what they would have liked to hear more of. So with that, I am, unless there's any further questions, Vaughn, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Lewis. That was excellent, and we appreciate it. Look forward to working with you again soon. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off here. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.